We have a really great lineup here for our panel. You've already met 3 of the people on the panel. The 4th person is Lee Byron. He is the maintainer of GraphQL and also Immutable.js at Facebook. Anything else?
So many things.
So many things. No, those are my 2 major projects. I also maintain a project called Data Loader, which is often used with GraphQL.
It's a good one.
Okay, so to get this panel started, I wanted to ask a question actually for you, Lee, which is a question that we often get. Is like, okay, so what's next for GraphQL? What's your vision?
There's a lot to do next. I can kind of like chop it into 2 buckets. One is kind of where like the kinds of problems that GraphQL can help us solve. So GraphQL is already really good at solving. I have a question, I get that data, and I get it back. I can do it in as few network requests as possible, and I can chop that up and co-locate what the data I need with the views that end up rendering it. So I can already do that. But what it's not good at yet is managing real-time data, managing data that's like the time to the most important piece of data in your query. So we often like chop our stuff up into different GraphQL queries where our important stuff is here and then everything else is over here. So I think we can probably do more to improve on those. But then the other bucket of stuff that I actually think is even more important is all the different tools that we need. So GraphQL is, we release a spec and we release a reference implementation, and a lot of the work that's happened so far has been kind of filling in the blanks on the server so that we can actually build GraphQL services. And now I think like the big next step is building good client tools. And you guys have been really beneficial with Apollo, but most of the work we've seen so far has been in JavaScript and for the web. And the reality is that most of application development right now is happening for mobile, specifically like native apps. And there just hasn't been a lot of experimentation with GraphQL clients for iOS or Android apps yet. So I'm really excited to see that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, it's really great to see that even though GraphQL is like relatively new or like hasn't been released as open source for very long, there's already a lot of excitement out there and people are using it and the tools are kind of maturing. And that kind of brings us to the next question that I wanted to ask, and that's kind of for everyone, is, everyone has kind of a different story of what brought them to GraphQL and what they're most excited about. So I'm kind of curious to know, what was the thing that you really thought about GraphQL? Oh, that's so amazing. Like, I want to start using that. Maybe this one's for Cyrus.
Okay. At the beginning, I was invited like to the Facebook offices, and they were releasing kind of like, or they were like saying that they will release GraphQL soon, and what was GraphQL about. And at the beginning, I was not believing GraphQL. I was like, that's not for me. That's gonna work for Facebook, but I don't know. Like, it's not gonna work in my kind of structure of backend. But actually, when they open source the GraphQL.js implementation, I start seeing like the value because I could play with it. And when I start playing with it, I could see like all the value on GraphQL, and not just like one fetching in just one response in one HTTP response, but more than that, like the way the types were defined, like also that we avoid versioning, API versioning, or normal API versioning. So there are a lot of cool things. And more than that, for me, the introspection was like the main thing. Because with introspection, you can have validation, you can have like GraphQL or whatever other tools you want to build on top of that. And that's a very big thing.
Yeah, I can go. So I've been working at Meteor for about 2 years now, almost, and we actually took kind of a funny detour to get to GraphQL because I think a lot of people are coming to GraphQL from REST or from something like that, like HTTP requests. But Meteor has a totally reactive, completely real-time WebSocket-based pub subsystem. And how we got here was we were actually thinking about like how can we bring the experience of using a real-time WebSocket system that relies on live querying the database, but to every backend. And it's funny because we also ended up at GraphQL. We started thinking, we were like, okay, we need to be able to aggregate data requirements from different components. We need to be able to have an agnostic language to query from different databases. And even though GraphQL at the time, and still doesn't really have too many first-class primitives for reactivity or real-time built in, we figured it gave a very similar experience to what you got with Meteor, which is the core of the experience to me was just you asked for data and then you got it. And GraphQL is just like the best way of asking for data that I can think of right now.
So I was building React apps about 2 years ago at a company, and we were just constantly faced with the question of how do we get data into our apps. And I went to a tech talk at Facebook and heard the very vague, what you can say, what we could talk about publicly at that point, description of like, we have this thing that lets us magically get data, and I saw enough that I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. I want to work there, and so naturally when I joined, I work on Relay now. Yeah.
How about you, Lee? You kind of were around when I think GraphQL was open source.
So GraphQL just recently had its 4th birthday. Its first birthday as an open source project, but it's actually been being used at Facebook for quite some time before that. And I was part of the small team that co-created GraphQL. And Nick Strock's in the audience, who's also on that team, and then Dan Schaefer, who isn't here today, was the 3rd member of our team. And what we were really trying to do, I think all 3 of us came kind of with different goals and intentions. And my intention was to rebuild our iOS app, and specifically rebuild the newsfeed part of that app. And this was 4 years ago, 2012. And I don't know if you remember what the Facebook app felt like in 2012. It was pretty awful. And we had a lot of problems to solve, and one of the big problems to solve was making sure that we could get all of the information down the pipe quickly. And before that, we had used kind of a hodgepodge of different technologies, including our Facebook RESTful API, including another Facebook platform technology called FQL, which is kind of like an SQL-like syntax, will let you query Facebook data. And all of those had kind of their own problems. And Nick actually came with the idea, like the early idea for GraphQL, as the evolution of all of the work that he had been doing for like his previous years at the company, which was like getting a stronghold on the data in our actual server. And the next step was like, okay, like we have a really good way to represent data in PHP, but clearly development is happening outside of that now. And how do we bring the strong types and the kind of like async nature of fetching data and bring that outside of PHP? So Schrock came up with the first version of GraphQL that did that. And another member of our iOS team kind of like saw these 2 things happening and connected the dots. And so he introduced Nick and myself together. And then Dan, who's working on the newsfeed team at the time, we were working close with him because we were doing newsfeed. And like all of a sudden, like our 3 minds like exploded. We're like, holy crap, like this is gonna work. And we just kind of like didn't sleep for a good 3 weeks, and eventually GraphQL came out of that. Well, we slept after. Relationships were lost.
Yeah, I think that's kind of that's a.
I meant 3 weeks until we slept. Not to say we didn't stop working after that. Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like you experienced like a very extreme form of what everyone experiences when they discover GraphQL, that they're really excited about it.
Yeah, except that like usually people, each feature that they say like, oh, and it does that, that's really cool. Except that we were discovering that via like code review, where someone would come up with a cool idea and then put up the code, and then the other 2 of us would be like, whoa, yes, like this is going to be amazing. And it like GraphQL started kind of as like a much simpler version of what it is now, or at least like fewer of the like core ideas. The primary core idea that was there from the very beginning that Nick brought was this like hierarchical fetching of data. So that was there, but then we started to introduce the type system, and we started to introduce features like fragments to break things apart, and like each one of these features got introduced kind of over time in that first kind of year of GraphQL coming together. And every time it landed, like our iOS and Android teams would take it and run with it and build all kinds of cool stuff on the client. So yeah, we got to have those mind-blowing moments, but spread out over time.
Yeah, I think one thing that's actually really cool about GraphQL is like, it's one of those things where there's so many different things that could be separate technologies. Like you could have just REST with typed APIs, or you could have just nested data fetching but without typing, or you could have all of that but without a query language. But I feel like when it all comes together, that's when the magic happens. Like each of those things by themselves are not that exciting by themselves. Super cool.
Yeah. One thing that's always very interesting in open source projects that kind of take off and become very popular, that a lot of people want to contribute, but it's not always easy to kind of manage all these contributors. Or sometimes you feel like, okay, people want to contribute, but they don't actually make good pull requests, or they don't file issues the way that we'd like to. Or actually, you're doing an open source project and you want people to contribute, but somehow nobody's showing up. So I'm kind of curious to know from all four of you, like, what's your experience and kind of how do you manage that, and how would you like it to be?
I could start. So with Graphene, I just started alone, as like all open source projects. But I was believing that GraphQL was like the next big thing after peanut butter. That's a joke I have in the website. So I believe that was like the next big thing, and I just want to invest my time in something that I believe on. At the beginning, I was alone. Like I was like, oh, you can use my framework. Actually, thanks for the Slack channel, I started like spreading a little bit. People actually start buying the idea of GraphQL, and of these people, there were some people on Python. So it was difficult at the beginning. Like the first 100 stars was like very difficult, but after that, you get some traction, and some people like get involved in the process. And actually, there was some point that I was working like from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. in my work, and then go back to my home and work until 2 a.m. like for 3 months. Those, it was exciting because I was creating my baby and was very good. But actually, until one point, like probably like a few months ago, a lot of people start contributing, and from these people, like there are people that are kind of have more idea about like what is Graphene and all these things, and you can start delegating. So that's like kind of what I'm doing more right now.
I manage a handful of open source projects, so this one hits home. I try to keep this. So I think it's really important for any open source project to have a philosophy of what that project is for. And then that philosophy should guide how that project develops forward, and should also guide how to evaluate pull requests. Because a lot of the times when it gets tricky is somebody comes up with a really good idea and they have a pull request up and they're implementing it, and you're trying to kind of like noodle through what kind of feedback can I give? Should this be better? Does it live here? Should it be its own package? And if you have like a good solid philosophy on what this package is for and what to do, like what things go in it, what things go out of it, where they live, then I found that helps quite a lot in leading people to do the right thing. And also, it's hard for one project to be like a focal point for lots of development. And I've kind of seen that happen on a handful of different projects before, and the core maintainers end up just kind of like getting burnt out and wanting to run away. And I don't want to have that happen to me. So typically, most of the projects that I maintain have a philosophy, like kind of like the Unix philosophy, like do one thing and do it well, and then have a pluggable model so that other people can do things that work really well with it. And in the cases where it doesn't, the solution is almost never, oh, but you can't do this feature via like a modular way, so we have to add it into the core. And it's like, no, actually what you want is to figure out how to expose a new way to do your thing modularly. And that can sometimes be a little bit tricky, especially when someone's coming in with an agenda to get their feature built and they feel like they're getting kind of the runaround. It's like, you're making me do this extra work to make my feature work. But it's ultimately beneficial in the long run, because that initial work unlocks not only their one feature, but opens up an avenue to have like more of an ecosystem of that same kind of thing. So we tried to do that very intentionally with GraphQL.js as a reference implementation, and we hoped that that would be copied as people built GraphQL in other languages as well. So like the fact that the like middleware pattern is catching on for resolvers, I'm pretty excited about. There's more things that we can do to make it more modular, but making sure that we can have, if you're trying to do something and there aren't existing GraphQL tools that let you do that, you should feel like you have the available tools and support to build something that does it the way that you want to see it done, and it still works with everything else that's out there.
Yeah, I think that's super, super important. I think like the ability to let people do what they want with your tool instead of having to rebuild from the ground up, I think, is always the best. Like, for example, people can implement custom types for GraphQL. So now I'm also running into a situation where there's a ton of people out there who are building GraphQL clients with Redux, and so now I'm like, guys, can we all maybe like work together, factor out some libraries, so we're not all have 10 million versions of the same thing. Going back to the original question, the really cool thing for me was we, after we decided that GraphQL was like the best thing ever, we went and talked to a bunch of people, like probably dozens of different people who were using it in production, wanting something like that in production. And the best part was we came across somebody who actually already did the same thing that we were planning to do, which was these guys at New Spring Church that we're collaborating with on Apollo Client. So essentially from the very first day, there were like two halves to the development team where like development would never sleep. Like I would come in, I had some ideas that were like mostly philosophical, and then James would come in and be like, okay, we tried this in our actual app and like it didn't work, so here's like a pull request to fix that. And so that was super exciting, like just having, I think, having more than one person on the project, which you can easily just have one person for a long time. It was just super empowering to see like other people's ideas come in.
I mean, I guess, I don't know. This is my first big open source project that I've worked on. So, and I think for the Relay team as a whole, we're still kind of figuring it out, and getting good advice from Lee and Christopher Shadow and others at Facebook who have had a lot of experience. But I think what you kind of both touched on of trying to make the framework more modular, that have that Unix philosophy of keep it simple. That's something that Relay doesn't do today, but we've definitely seen over time that there's this very like clear tendency in pull requests to just like add things into the framework. And I think we initially kind of got sucked into that of like, oh, well, all right, how do we make this work? And then kind of once that hit a certain critical mass was like, okay, we got to step back and figure out how to make this more modular so that people can just do what they need to do. Yeah, so don't have too much to add, but yes.
I'll add one more thing to that just because I think it's important. One of the philosophies that Facebook has for its open source program in general is that we only open source the stuff that we're actually using at Facebook. And I don't know if you guys have ever open sourced something that's just totally unrelated to your day job. You've instantly created a second day job for yourself, and then you just like have this guilt because either you're like doing your day job well and then you're abandoning your open source project and you feel bad, or you're spending all your time on your open source project and you're abandoning your day job and you feel bad. And this is not a good thing. And if you open source the stuff that you're using day to day, then your day-to-day work influences not just your own work, but it influences people in the open source community as well. And then there's actually an incentive for when like people have issues or pull requests, they might have found a problem that you will find in the future and just haven't yet. And they're like, oh, this broke. And you're like, sweet, thanks for finding that bug before I did. Let me merge that in. Great, one less thing for me to worry about in the coming weeks. So I've tried to make sure that as we've like guided the tools that we release around GraphQL at Facebook, that we're only open sourcing the stuff that we're actually going to use at Facebook. And for all the other stuff, we're like, this would be a great idea, but it's not our place to do it. And we'll kind of like seed it out there and talk to people and try to get other folks excited about building stuff.
Do you ever feel a tension, I wonder, about like stuff that you, like if somebody submits a pull request that you will never need, somehow like if someone came down and told you will never need this feature, how do you prioritize supporting that versus not?
Yeah, I mean, it's like taking it at face value. It's a pretty brutal but efficient like way to filter things. And sometimes that makes some pull requests get filtered to the top before others. I don't know, like at the end of the day, I think it's a good thing because I have a limited amount of time that I can spend dealing with issues and pull requests. And if I flip through the pull requests, I'm like, yes, like I've been wanting to do that for a while and someone finally put up a pull request to do that thing I wanted to do. I'm going to focus on that one first before some other ones. But obviously, like anything that's like, I found a bug, I'm gonna like, oh crap, great. Like I gotta make sure that that's fixing something because we probably have the same bug and just didn't realize it yet.
So we're all like pretty hyped about GraphQL, I think, but no technology is perfect. So I'm curious to know from you guys, like, what are the things that you think GraphQL doesn't do well, and how could that be improved?
I think one thing that, I mean, for GraphQL, you have to control the client because it's the client who decides the data that it wants. And before you have this logic on the server. And when you switch the responsibility to the client, you have to trust the client. So actually, kind of like making a tool, like open sourcing like all your APIs through GraphQL could be a little bit dangerous for like just your business. Or things like that. So, or maybe just like they are gonna do like harmful queries that you don't want to run, or all these kind of things that you have to trust the clients that they are like querying your data, and that's important. But there is no solution for that.
I was just going to ask, like, how does Facebook actually solve that problem?
Which problem in particular?
Of letting people do arbitrary queries.
Yeah, so first of all, our GraphQL server is an internal server, right? We don't, like, third-party applications can't query Facebook's GraphQL server. So that's kind of like one possible attack vector kind of cleared. The second is we build good tools for client developers to get a good understanding of what they're doing, and so we don't have to worry too much. So like one of those things is that we validate queries on the client before they're even checked in, as like a lint rule. So bad queries can't even make it into the client code bases, let alone to the server. The other thing that is pretty important about how GraphQL works is that you only expose through GraphQL what you know to be possible to make fast on the server, right? And this is why GraphQL doesn't have like a first-class notion of order bys or sort by field or something like that, where you would have to build an index for every, you can write a SQL query that's just like insanely slow, runs n squared on the size of your table. And there's just no way to stop that except having like some poor DBA who sits somewhere and like sees a query and is like, oh, that one again, and like figures out who to whack on the head. And like we don't have that role because we don't have to have that role because we just don't expose the possibility to write a query that's slow. So we largely kind of escape it. Both you can't write bad queries and we like evade the attack vector of like the general public sending us random queries.
Did you ever think about like maybe open sourcing, not open sourcing, but opening your GraphQL endpoint to like the world?
Yes-ish. So the hard part is just the details of how to do permissions and privacy checking and all of that. Facebook has a really sophisticated system for doing privacy checking of data, and there's kind of two sides to the coin. One side is who you are using the service. So like I'm me, and I can see my own data, and I can see Nick's data because we're friends, but only some of it. And I can't see Mark Zuckerberg's data because I'm not friends with him, right? And so when I load data from GraphQL, because GraphQL is just kind of a thin layer on top of our existing systems, all that's taken care of for me. But then there's the second side of it, which is what application am I using to like do these queries on behalf of? And right now, the assumption with the GraphQL server is you're just using one of the Facebook apps. And if you're using one of the Facebook apps, then we're like, great, you can do whatever you want. But if you were using a random third-party app, if you ever used an app through Facebook, you have to like give it permission to do things, right? And so those permissions also factor into those privacy rules, and they, for kind of historical reasons, live in a slightly different system that isn't integrated into the thing that sits under GraphQL, and so it'd be kind of a major effort to do that. And another reason is the way people use the Facebook API is pretty different from the way that we use the Facebook API. We actually originally, like back in 2012, we were really thinking about this should just be the public Facebook API, and then we will use it, right? Like eat your own dog food. And it was actually the platform team that convinced us that this was wrong, because the only people building newsfeed is Facebook. So it is actually not a good idea to expose like a full-featured Facebook newsfeed API to anyone except our own developers. Because as soon as you do, they're going to use it for some like insane other idea, and they're going to rely on it. And then as we need to iterate our product quickly, we'll actually accidentally break some third-party app. So we just avoid all that stuff by having it being an internal API.
So apart from the concern of like clients making dangerous queries, what other things are there that that you think GraphQL doesn't do very well?
So I think any technology it's not about it doing something well or not well. It's about strengths and weaknesses, right? Any technology is kind of like a point on the trade-off continuum, and If we just want to like compare GraphQL to REST, for example, just because that's the most typical comparison, what REST is really good at is mapping directly to an HTTP surface and then reusing all the tools that you get when you use HTTP, right? You can use a browser cache. Anytime some like new HTTP, like HTTP 2 comes out with new features, just like all of a sudden every REST API automatically got an upgrade, right? So GraphQL like picked a different point on that trade-off continuum because we often talk about like, here are the problems with REST, here's how they're solved in GraphQL, and we're like, yay, GraphQL is better. But to its credit, REST can do a much simpler caching model than GraphQL can. Right? So you have a different kind of point on that curve. And actually to say like, all right, great, well then let's use the caching mechanism that REST uses, we would have to give up a lot of the stuff that we find valuable about GraphQL. So I think we end up kind of at like a crossroads between what things we care about and what things we don't care about. And it ended up being the case that we cared far more about the speed over mobile networks and the ability to express the data that you wanted, more so than like a very simple caching mechanism. And so we ended up building complicated caching mechanisms instead.
What kind of limitations of like GraphQL did you run into like building Relay, Joe?
So yeah, it's a good question. I think you can kind of see that in the Relay API. So places where there are things like we have a defer feature that's available internally. We haven't brought that yet to open source, although someone in the community is working on it. But that's the ability to say, part of this subquery, this subfragment, we don't need it right away. So actually fetch everything but this, render, and then go get this data, and then render with that extra information. And so this idea of defer, and like obviously that could become a directive, and I think we're talking and exploring that idea. Things like, so list views, where right now if you fetch 10 items, you get 10 items back. You're naturally going to write all 10 into your store and then render 10 items. But if you could, for example, get one item at a time back from the server, render the first item, render the second item, render the third item, you just get a lot better buffering and throughout the entire process. So that is something that we are iterating on internally right now. Again, just for performance reasons. So I think it's kind of mainly things that are already like kind of in the GraphQL future like spec and like or kind of that you've been thinking about. Another big one would be, so with React, we have, kind of, you're used to the idea of, I pass in props and that configures the component, right? So I can have a button and I can choose whether to have it be toggled or not toggled. Or maybe I have a profile picture component that has a size, and we want to be able to configure that size. And so depending on what your UI patterns are, you may have these very, very configurable components, and yet you have a static query. And so right now, fragments don't take arguments, which has a lot of benefits. Because it means that the response shape is predictable. The thing is that if you're building tooling on top of it, you can kind of do more complex dynamic things. And so in Relay, we are able to say, well, actually, that restriction doesn't make sense for us because we're making a dynamic query. And so I think that's one area where if you have this dynamic client, then it becomes natural to want to express certain things. And so we're kind of still sorting out that tension.
Yeah, there's kind of an interesting the historical path of GraphQL, because our iOS app was the very first client that used GraphQL. So we kind of developed in lockstep where the things that made the most sense for how our iOS app would work were the things that we prioritized first in GraphQL. And that ended up actually making kind of like a very happy outcome, because all of the concerns that you face building like a performant and good data-rich mobile application that needs to live on a crappy mobile network kind of happened. And then much later, Relay tried to bring those ideas back to the web and introduced a lot of really cool ideas that we hadn't been doing yet, like actually co-locating the bits of your query right next to the views that's going to render them. That's a Relay innovation, and now we're like trying to figure out how to bring that back to our iOS and our Android apps. But at the same time, Relay, living in JavaScript, which is a much more dynamic programming environment, wanted to introduce more of this dynamicism that like maybe if the ordering of these had been reversed, where the first thing we tried to do was build stuff for the desktop web, and then later tried to build stuff for the iOS apps, we might have ended up with different decisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're almost out of time, so we have to wrap up pretty soon, but I just want to ask like one last question for each one of you, and that's, if someone wanted to learn GraphQL or wanted to try out GraphQL, where should they go? maybe Sashko, you can take this one.
Well, I guess we can.
Yeah,
We can each talk
everyone will
about
get a chance.
our respective sources for learning GraphQL.
I was going to say read their blog.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one thing we have been focusing a lot since we got started is learning about GraphQL in depth and writing about what we've been learning about also in depth. So we do have a blog where we post a lot of that stuff. But I think the blog is not necessarily like, a lot of those posts are quite in depth and maybe not a good place to get started. But I think some of these things like a talk that Steve Lucier gave recently about 0 to GraphQL in 30 minutes was the most stellar display of live coding I've ever experienced. I've been trying to reproduce it ever since in my bedroom, right? But then, Jonas has also a great tutorial that takes you through loading data from lots of multiple data sources, which I think is the best feature of GraphQL, actually, the ability to, like his tutorial has a thing where you can load from Mongo, SQL, and a REST API to get fortune cookie strings. Yeah.
For me, I will say, like, go and play with it. And play with it, like, you have the Star Wars API for playing, like, either in JavaScript, Python, I don't know if in Scala, but you have these things, and you can start playing with it and see, like, how it could fit in your current architecture. And from that, like, probably you will find the resources to accomplish what you want. But actually seeing it, the real thing, it's quite valuable. So like your blogs or your posts, and like the website Learn GraphQL, I think is also good. But overall, play with it.
Yeah, I mean, all the suggestions so far, definitely call out Stephen Lucier's talk, 0 to GraphQL in 30 minutes. And then also he has a GitHub repo up that has the examples from that. And I think there's been a pull request to add a different language. I think it might have been Scala example as well. So you can kind of actually see like all the examples, actual code, and run it.
There's a website, Learn GraphQL. That one's pretty great. Everything those guys just said is great. There's also a site called makeitopen.com, which is a little bit more than just GraphQL, but it may be useful to see like what does a real app look like if you're using GraphQL, Relay, React Native, and it like ties all the pieces together. And it is not only all the code that's required. It's the app from the F8 conference. So one of the Facebook engineers built kind of like top to bottom everything like from the server, the iOS, the Android app, the website for F8. And then he wrote a bunch of articles like explaining how the different like technologies he used played out. And they're really excellent. So that's a good resource as well. And then I would just kind of end with there's needs to be more of this stuff. So like if you dive in and say like, oh man, I needed to learn this thing, and it was a relatively like intermediate to advanced topic, and I just like couldn't find a really good article on this, write one. Post on Medium, post it somewhere, or just like message me, because we're always taking kind of guest contributors to the GraphQL.org blog. There's also GraphQL.org, although the content there is not as good as it could be. So let's make it better.
Yeah, and I want to go one step beyond that, which is I think the best way to learn exactly how it works is to implement your own library or your own tool around it. If you go and you find that, oh, like, yeah, I love GraphQL, but like it doesn't do this thing, just try making that thing work. And I think I learned like way more by just trying to implement some stuff in JavaScript than from reading any amount of blog posts.
Well, thank you very much. Those are all really great tips, and I think we had a really nice discussion. So thanks to everyone in the audience for coming, and if you like this, we'll be doing more of this. Well, we'll be doing more of this even if you don't like it, because we're having a great time. But yeah, so make sure to check out our meetup online on meetup.com. And if you missed some of the talks or didn't catch everything, we'll be uploading the videos on our Apollo Stack YouTube channel, so you can go check them out there. I'll also ask like the speakers for links to the things that I recommended, so we'll put them there as well. All right, that's it for today, and thanks for coming.